we have everybody muted for now, but we'll open it up at the end of the presentation and turn it into a conversation.
All right, it's 7 o'clock, so I am going to just start us off. People will trickle in as they come in. Like Emily said, hold on one second. I need to, sorry about that, everybody. I'm live streaming the event and it was echoing back at me. So like Emily said, we're going to keep you muted for now, but there will be a time when you're able to ask questions. And so you'll be able to unmute yourself then if you have a question for the group. By way of introduction, my name is Kaylin Murphy. I'm the Development Administrator at Joshua's Trust. We are really glad that you're able to join us tonight. We hope that this will be a helpful webinar for you as we enter into fall and then eventually spring in preparing your yard and garden for pollinators. I'm going to introduce Emily and then she's going to take it away. Emily May is a pollinator conservation specialist with the pesticide program at the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation. She has an MS in entomology and ecology evolutionary biology from Michigan State University and has studied habitat restoration, bees nesting habits, specialty crop pollination, and effects of pest management practices on wild bees community. She has been working with the Xerces Society since 2015 and has focused on supporting pollinators through habitat creation and mitigating pesticide risk to bees and other beneficial insects. So with that, I am going to let Emily take it away.
Great, thanks so much. And I hope you're able to admit people out of the waiting room.
Yes.
From here, that would be great.
Absolutely.
So thanks everybody for joining us, and thanks to Joshua's Trust for organizing this and inviting me to talk. I'm Emily May. I'm a pollinator conservation specialist with the Xerces Society. So today I figured we'd talk through planting for pollinators in Connecticut, and this talk is really meant for sort of yards and gardens and how we can support pollinators with native plants and building wildlife habitat into our communities. So it's more sort of small scale, but I will mention a couple of things for folks who have larger areas to manage. If there are folks joining us from outside of Connecticut, the specific plants I'm talking about are most relevant for the Northeast, but general concepts should be relevant wherever you're listening in from. So looking forward to answering questions at the end. If you haven't heard of the Xerces Society, we've been around for almost 50 years, working to protect wildlife through the conservation of invertebrates and their habitat. Our name is a reference to the Xerces blue butterfly, which is believed to be the first American butterfly to go extinct due to human development. It lived in the coastal sand dunes around San Francisco. And we do a variety of on-the-ground conservation work with programs in pollinators and agricultural biodiversity, endangered species, pesticides, and a new community engagement program that focuses more on urban communities. Our main office is in Portland, but we have field staff in over 16 states around the country working on pollinator habitat restoration, conservation planning, and technical support in agricultural, natural, and urban areas. This is my colleague Kelly in New Jersey, who works with the U.S. Department of Ag, Natural Resource Conservation Service, to help farmers and land managers in the Mid-Atlantic and Northeast create habitat for pollinators. We have a couple of other more recent programs. Be Better Certified is a certification program for farms and businesses that adopt management practices that support pollinators. And then we have more urban programs, Bee City USA and Bee Campus USA, that support communities that are providing healthy habitat and protection from pesticides. But a lot of what we do is write really detailed science-based guides for protecting pollinators and other invertebrates. And all of these are found on our website, which is xerces.org. So there's a whole library of many decades of work going back on lots of different insects as well as other invertebrates, the little things that run the world. So when I say we conserve invertebrates, that means any animal that doesn't have a backbone. So many classes of animals, from insects to crustaceans. But they account for over 95% of animal biodiversity on the planet and play really critical roles for our survival, including helping to break down organic matter, keeping pest populations in check, serving as food. They're the base of the food chain for many animals, and pollinating crops and wildflowers. So sustaining the abundance, diversity, and biomass of invertebrates, the base of the food chains, is really essential for healthy ecosystems. But I'm really here to just talk to you about one of those important functions for ecosystems, which is pollination. So more than 85% of flowering plants need an animal, which is mostly insects, to move pollen from the male part of the flower to the female part of the flower in order to set seeds and nuts and fruits. And having a diverse pollinator community is really essential for sustaining both natural areas as well as productive agricultural lands. Pollinators are really valuable for wildlife and natural systems. They allow wild flowering plants to reproduce and continue to reseed in their environments. The seeds and fruits that those flowering plants produce are also food sources for many other types of wildlife, from birds to mammals. And through the simple act of moving pollen from flower to flower, they're building out that base of the food chain for many species. And they're also part of that food chain themselves in many cases. About 9 in 10 bird species eat insects at some point in their lives. And caterpillars, which are larval butterflies and moths, are an incredibly important protein source for many birds, especially when feeding their young. Pollinators are also important for us, for our diet. So this photo you may have seen before. It's from a small project we did with Whole Foods. This is what a typical produce section looks like, with all the pollinated foods that we enjoy. And then this is what a produce section would look like without pollinators. So in this just small case study, over half of the items of the produce section were taken off the shelves because all of those depend on pollinators. Lots of less color and fewer vitamins available if we were to lose pollination. On a personal level, pollinators contribute to two very critical parts of my diet, which are coffee and chocolate. Chocolate's actually unusual in that it's pollinated by a fly, which is the cacao midge. So this is a picture of the cacao flower, which is an intricate and small flower that have nectaries that are difficult to access for bees and other larger insects, but it's perfectly sized for this little furry midge. So gotta give thanks to the cacao midge for all it does for us. So who's responsible in general for this essential service? There's lots of different animals that visit flowers, usually for the sugary nectar that those flowers provide, and they end up pollinating those plants. And plants require a diversity of pollinators in most cases for effective and sustainable pollination. So butterflies, flies, beetles, moths, birds, bats, lots of different things pollinate. But among all pollinators, bees are really the most important. And we have a really amazing diversity of native bees in the US. We have nearly 3,600 species of native bees in the US and Canada, and 5,000 when you include Central America. And there's over 350 species of bees here in Connecticut. So they range in size from really big carpenter bees that get into your sheds to tiny bees that are about the size of a freckle on your face. A lot of them don't even look like what you might expect when you think about a bee, like metallic green sweat bees, or even that sort of metallic blue-green mason bee up in the top right. So bees are important pollinators because, unlike most of the animals that you saw on the last slide, bees are actively collecting and transporting pollen back to their nest to feed their larvae. So they have lots of different specialized body features for collecting pollen, and many native bees are moving pollen around dry. So the sweat bee up on the top left is carrying pollen dry, kind of around the top of her legs and the the upper half one for abdomen. The leafcutter bee that's just below her all the way to the left has beautiful scopi that collect pollen on the bottom of the abdomen, so they can kind of belly flop onto a flower and collect all that pollen dry, which makes them really great pollinators because they're just moving tons of pollen around on these really specialized hairs that are meant for carrying pollen back to their nest. They also tend to be more efficient than some other things, like butterflies kind of amble around from flower to flower. Bees are on a schedule. They want to collect pollen very efficiently. So they do not waste time. They learn how to handle a particular kind of flower, and they tend to go back to that same kind of flower and collect pollen very efficiently. Going to the same species over and over again is actually great for actually pollinating that flower because it's carrying pollen from the same species of plant. So I could keep going on and on about bees and their flower handling efficiency, but I should probably keep moving. I did want to quickly talk about honeybees, which are probably the first bee that typically would pop into people's heads when bees come into a conversation. But the European honeybee is kind of a unique species. It is only one species relative to the many hundreds that we have of native bees here in Connecticut. And it was brought to the US by ship with colonists. It's very unique. It's a social bee with a caste system that has a queen that's doing the egg laying, and then workers that are carrying out all the different functions of the hive, and then drone bees or male bees. It typically, the honeybee has multiple generations a year of eggs that are laid by the queen that come out and become, nurse bees and foraging bees. And it's perennial. So most native bees are annual, meaning they just live typically for a few weeks, and then they will overwinter. Their eggs or larvae or pupae will overwinter, come out the next year. But honeybees live for several years, or the colony will live for several years before the queen is replaced, typically. And they overwinter by feeding on their honey stores. They've co-evolved with humans for generations, and their colonies are actively managed for pollination and honey. So that's very unique among bees. Most bees are much more inconspicuous and live below ground. They're quite different from honeybees. So the vast majority of our native bees live below ground, just tiny holes to give any sign that they're there. About a third live above ground in plant stems and tunnels in dead wood. So on the right there is a Seratina bee, which is a small carpenter bee living in a blueberry cane. And then a small fraction of native bees, the bumblebees, form colonies in hollow cavities, which could be above ground or below ground, but most commonly are old rodent holes. So ground nesting bees, these are some pictures of what those nests might look like from the soil surface, which is, they're a little bit difficult to study, as I found out trying to spend a couple years studying bee nesting in different habitats. But a lot of them can look a bit like ant nests, or they can really just look like a hole. Most often they're found in bare soil. And when I say bare soil, it can mean that there's vegetation around it, but when you get down to the base of a plant, there's some bare soil surface that they can burrow into that isn't covered by a lot of thatch or leaf litter. This is what a nest looks like if you cut it away underground. There can be really complicated nest architectures underground if you follow them down. But basically what happens is the female excavates the nest down and then creates these little cells where she puts her pollen and nectar provisions and then lays an egg on top of them. Many of these bees have some kind of waxy secretion that they line these cells with that help protect those developing larvae and all that pollen provision from soil moisture and the various fungi that might be in the soil. So these nests can be anywhere from a couple of centimeters down to over a meter into the soil. And that can be really variable depending on the bee species. So a solitary bee which is in contrast to a social bee like a honeybee or a bumblebee that has a queen and lots of workers carrying out the tasks. Solitary bee is what the life cycle of most native bees, and it's just a single female that is doing all of the tasks of providing for her offspring. So this is a mining bee. This would be a year in the life of a mining bee. So right now, let's take a late season mining bee. Most of them come out in the spring, but let's say there's a couple of things that might be out right now. Going out collecting pollen and nectar, excavating her nest and laying building a pollen and nectar ball that she then lays an egg on. That egg develops into a larvae, feeds on the pollen ball, and then overwinters either as a pupae or as an adult and comes out the same time as their mother the following year. So that's sort of what the life cycle looks like. Similarly, most stem nesting bees are also solitary. About 30% of native bees are nesting in stems or tunnels. And this is what a stem nesting bee's nest looks like. So this is just a hollow reed that is about the same size as a mason bee that's gone in. And the mason bee is called that because they use mud to partition the cells of their nest. So she's gone out, she's collected mud, she's formed a partition at the back of this tunnel, and then she goes out to lots of flowers, collects pollen and nectar, builds this pollen ball again, lays an egg, goes out, collects mud, makes a partition, etc., until the tunnel is completely full. Interesting thing about bees is that they can determine whether they are going to fertilize an egg or not, which means that a female bee can choose to lay a female offspring or a male offspring. And so these tunnel nesting bees often will lay females towards the back of the tunnel where they're more protected from predators, because really they're going to be the ones really carrying out the duties of the single mother the next year. So they'll make those more protected and then lay the males towards the front. So the males are the first ones to come out the next year, and they're ready and waiting to do the mating activities the next spring. So that's kind of what a stem nesting bee's nest looks like. It can take over 1,000 flower visits to make one of those pollen balls. So you can imagine how one bee could be contributing quite a bit to the pollination of plants in the area. I did just want to mention quickly bee hotels. So there's been a kind of proliferation of bee hotels as a way to provide nesting habitat for above ground nesting bees. And I will say that there's variation in the quality of these in terms of what they actually are supporting, and what will come and lay eggs in them. So on the left there is it's called a bee hotel or butterfly house actually. But typically we've only been seeing kind of paper wasps nest in there because it doesn't really mimic the habitat of those insects. On the right, we have a bee hotel that is made from cardboard tubes that have paper liners. And this is, if you are going to have a bee hotel, sort of the way that we'd recommend you do it, which is to do it in a way that's able to be cleaned out. That's the nice thing about the paper liners, because if you just kind of leave everything, if you drill holes in wood, for example, and have a lot of that concentrated in one area and just sort of leave it be, over time you can get some buildup of parasites. So we do recommend not having a huge concentration of this nesting habitat, and if you are going to do it, think about having materials that are a little bit easier to be cleaned, like these lined tubes or binder block that can be pulled apart. So if you have more questions about that, we can talk about that at the end. And then last bit on the nesting habitat here is just some pictures of what cavity nesting bee or bumblebee habitat can look like. So these are all from one of my colleagues' farms. So she had bumblebees nesting in a raised bed that had a lot of organic matter. They tend, a lot of times in spring when you turn your compost pile, you'll find queen bumblebees have overwintered in it because they are attracted to the warmer temperatures. And then she found a bumblebee nest in some straw mulch, and then one that was in a rodent hole under some pine needles. So they'll often seek out abandoned mouse nests, which come with a lot of fur that they can then use to keep their nests warm. So lots of different environments for bumblebees to nest in. So coming back to the big picture, why do we need to talk about conservation of pollinators? So we don't always have the monitoring data to say this species is in decline or that species is in decline, but there's a fair amount of evidence suggesting that on the whole, we're seeing declines in abundance of many pollinating species due to the same stress factors that threaten other kinds of wildlife. So some of those big buckets of risk factors are habitat loss, so conversion of open space and farmland for development. We think of agricultural expansion as something that happened in the past, but land conversion for ag and urban development continues to expand really rapidly. Between 2008 and 2012, over 7 million acres of uncultivated land were converted to crops in the US, which is an area twice the size of Connecticut. We also have widespread pesticide use across urban and agricultural areas, all of which poses a risk to pollinators. We have disease and invasive species. So there's commercial and captive rearing of different pollinators, which is largely unregulated and can spread some disease. And then we also have climate change, which is the most unpredictable of all of these variables, but can lead to changes in habitat and the timing of bloom, and we're seeing some changes in population distributions over time. So that's a big sort of unknown. But the good news is that there are steps that we can take to address all of these threats. So on habitat, which is really what I'm going to focus on today, we can conserve and create habitat. With pesticides, we can reduce reliance on pesticides and protect the habitat that we put in place from pesticide drift. And then, I'm not really going to talk about this today, but there are ways to reduce risks from managed and invasive species. And with climate change, we can build planning for species and habitat diversity into our species lists, our plant lists. By building resilience into our plant communities, we can help bees and other pollinators be more resilient to climate change and expected changes in precipitation and heat, etc. So why did I start by talking about nesting biology? Because biology really helps us inform habitat design and to help us even understand what habitat is. So we know that bees and other beneficial insects need food, so that's nectar, pollen, and host plants. They need shelter, so nesting sites and sites for overwintering safely. And then they need protection and refuge, so protection from pesticide risk, and then a variety of habitat disturbances. So most of the rest of this talk is going to focus on smaller spaces like yards and gardens, but I did want to mention, since this is a land trust, that the first step for people and organizations managing larger pieces of land is to conserve and protect existing natural areas, which serve as refuges for beneficial insects and other wildlife, and sources of those insects for the rest of the landscape. So we can protect and improve natural areas by restoring degraded areas or heavily invaded areas, and protecting flowering areas from pesticide drift. If you have a large area to manage, it can feel a little overwhelming to figure out how to proceed with different projects for pollinator conservation. So if you're in that place, we have some guides that could help. We have pollinator habitat assessment guides for pollinators that help quantify different habitat characteristics like nesting habitat and foraging habitat at the landscape and at the site level, and then help identify and prioritize different areas for improvement. So this pictured guide, which is available on the website, is for farms and agricultural landscapes. So it includes a section that evaluates pest management practices. But for land trusts and other natural areas managers, we have a different guide, which is more relevant for those natural areas. So getting back to the rest of us, identifying and protecting existing habitat is the first step for pollinator conservation, but we also want to be thinking about how we can create and where we can create new habitat. So one other feature of habitat that I really haven't mentioned yet is connectivity, or the ability for a pollinator to fly from one habitat patch to the next. And urban environments in particular can be difficult for pollinators to move through. Patches of habitat in urban regions are often limited to areas along rivers or in parks, but there are ways we can act to create additional habitat and connect patches through corridors. So there's a great example of community collaboration here in Connecticut with garden groups, land trusts, river conservation groups, and communities coming together around pollinators to connect habitat patches in a concerted effort. And that's the Pollinator Pathways Project. So it started in one town and has spread to nearly 100 towns. I'm probably out of date on the number, but the original idea was to connect existing green spaces with patches of habitat in backyards and to engage neighbors around pollinator awareness. And it has just absolutely taken off. So if you haven't heard about it yet, definitely check it out. I believe that Kaylin will be pointing out a sign opportunity at the end of this for the Land Trust members. Along with a variety of outreach events, one outreach tactic I really liked from this project was one of the local organizations used door hangers, saying something like the pollinator pathway, be on it, to advertise the project to homes that were along the pathway, which I thought was just so clever. Because the great news is really that unlike a lot of other big, overwhelming conservation issues, pollinators are a group of animals that we can really help in our backyards, and small spaces can make pretty great habitat and be important for wild pollinators. So where do we start? So if you're not a natural areas manager, I would take a look at the lawn around your house if you have lawn. We have over 40 million acres of lawn in the US, and amazingly, turf grass is considered the single largest irrigated crop in the country. And by and large, these turf grass lawns support far fewer pollinators, beneficial insects, and other wildlife like songbirds than would flowering native plants. So that's one place to start, is lawn conversion. But what do you replace lawn with? What do I plant for pollinators? So really, the best place to start is thinking about high-value native perennial plants. So plants that will continue flowering from year to year and provide really high-quality pollen and nectar resources for pollinators. The next thing to think about is, how can I have something in bloom at any given time through the growing season, so that if a bee comes out in May, they'll have something to feed on. If a bee comes out in June, they'll have something to feed on, etc. And ideally having more than one thing in bloom at any given time. So one thing I've taken to doing in my own yard is actually just noting down the phenology of the plants that I've put in there. And I'm trying to sort of iron out, where do I have gaps in bloom where one thing is coming out of bloom and I need something to fill a gap. And what I'll do is I'll just walk around the neighborhood and see, okay, what's blooming around me, and are bees visiting it? And then I figure out what it is and I try and put it in my yard. So that's how I've plugged a lot of bloom gaps in my own yard. Some of the other things to consider are host plants for butterflies, or nesting plants for bees that use different kinds of stems. So I have bee balm in my yard, which is a wonderful pollinator plant. And then when I clear out the yard in early spring, as temperatures rise, I snip it back, and then over the summer, I've often had small carpenter bees nesting in the Monarda, the bee balm stems, through the summer. Other things to consider are if they're appropriate for the site. So if you have, this would be true for any gardener making these kinds of decisions, but if you have like a dry, sandy yard, picking plants that are going to deal well with those soil conditions, as well as the shade conditions of your yard. And then making sure that you're sourcing seeds and plants that are free of pesticides, knowing that in the nursery trade, many transplants, unless you're sourcing from a native plant nursery or a nursery that specifies that they're not using pesticides, many of those plants from big box stores have been treated with systemic insecticides. So just be cautious of that, and where you can, talk with your nursery about their practices before you go ahead and plant something straight out of the big box stores. So some of the things that are great for planting in Connecticut, so in early spring, it's the woody plants that come out and flower first. And some of these are just wonderful plants, not only for pollinators, but for other wildlife. So willows and maples, serviceberry, redbud, your spring ephemerals. So you have your shrubs and trees, and then moving into your forbs. So some of the things that we'll put into pollinator plantings for the earliest bloom from on the herbaceous side are golden alexanders, which look like kind of like a yellow Queen Anne's lace. They're in the carrot family, and then penstemon. Moving into summer, bee balm, monarda, as well as dotted mint, also a monarda, are wonderful pollinator plants. Coreopsis or tick seed is a great attractor, and I've had tall coreopsis blooming for going on 4 months now. A variety of milkweeds. You can choose the one that best fits your yard and garden conditions. Sunflowers, another shrub, buttonbush if you've got a moist area, blazing star, and evening primrose. And there's some neat dusk plants, bees that will come out right around that evening time that have these big eyes that visit evening primrose, along with a variety of moths. So something to look out for. You might not think bees are out at dusk, but there are a few bees that come out at dusk. And then around this time of year, your goldenrods and asters are the big heavy hitters for pollinators. Sneezeweed, which isn't as bad as it sounds, Joe Pye weed, of course, and ironweed or Vernonia. There's lots of great options for colorful late season bloom. And all along thinking about larval host plants. So the obvious one, of course, is milkweeds for the monarch. The milkweeds, or Asclepias, species of Asclepias, are obligate host plants for monarch caterpillars. And we've seen a huge decline in monarchs over the last 20 years. Milkweeds are great and is a nectar source for lots of other insects as well. You'll see all kinds of insects visiting them. But that's just one plant, plant genus that is important for one kind of butterfly. So if you're interested in host plants for other butterflies, a good online resource is the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center, which is based in Texas, but wildflower.org, which should be relatively easy to remember. But they have host plant lists for all kinds of other butterflies. So if you're wondering if the plants in your yard support butterflies, you can go in and search wildflower.org's host plant lists and find out. Or if you're wanting to support a particular kind of butterfly, you can look for that way as well. So one other thing I wanted to mention about plant selection is just a lot of the things that I was used to planting in my yard growing up, like impatiens and some other pretty annual species that are very ornamental and showy. Oftentimes those kinds of plants can look pretty, but don't have much habitat value. In some cases, the showiness of a plant is kind of inversely related to how pollinated it is. So double petals, for example, are often taking the place of anthers, or the plant structure that has pollen. So double petaled flowers often have little to no pollen, or their nectar is inaccessible, like some of the cultivated roses as well. So one of the things to look for is just watch your plants and figure out, what's actually getting visited by different kinds of insects. And again, one more plug for making sure your plants aren't pre-treated with insecticides. If you have systemic insecticides in a plant from a nursery, I would have concerns about that insecticide being expressed in that pollen and nectar of that plant. So do look into your nursery's pest management practices. So I just wanted to mention a couple opportunities outside of your yard or around your yard if you have the space. for putting pollinator plants in. So a rain garden is a place where a lot of pollinator-friendly plants will thrive. And ongoing research around urban spaces is telling what all of us with gardens already know, which is that urban gardens, these kinds of rain gardens, provide floral and nesting resources that improve reproduction and survival of bees. So the presence of flowers in all kinds of different urban habitats is consistently correlated with pollinator health. Another place that you might not think to put pollinator friendly flowers would be woodland understory planting. So this is a picture with Aquilegia canadensis, wild columbine, which is a great plant also for hummingbirds. Nectar is actually a critical part of a few kinds of birds' diets. I don't know of any birds that actually consume nectar exclusively, because most have a mixed diet that also includes insects. But hummingbirds and sunbirds, orioles, warblers, chickadees, and others will sip nectar, which is kind of like an energy drink for flight. So including some of those species that birds will sip out of is a good strategy for supporting all kinds of pollinators in your yard. And then nesting habitat. So we've talked a lot about flowering habitat, but how can you incorporate nesting habitat? So some of it is actually just by not mulching everything. So as I said before, bees like to have a little bit of exposed dirt that they can get into. That can be underneath and around your plants. So if you like to mulch for weed control, which I do, it's nice for keeping neat and tidy in the front yard, and also for moisture for the plants. But I'll usually leave 1 or 2 foot section at the back of the front yard that isn't mulched at all and just has some open bare dirt for bees to burrow into, to make sure that there's some space available for those ground nesting bees. And then having some bunch grasses as well provides structure and some nice overwintering sites for a variety of different insects. It's actually not hard at all to pick plants that stem nesting bees like to nest in. There's lots of different plants that have a pithy or a hollow stem. So Joe Pye weed, bee balm, coneflowers, sunflowers, roses, lots of different things have a pithy stem that bees will nest in. What I tend to do, because I get asked a lot about how to manage for those, so you can leave your plants intact over the winter, and then prune them back in the spring. So when temperatures start getting up into the 50s and 60s, prune them back to open up the stems and create those nest sites. And you can cut those at a variety of different heights. And then you just look to see what gets used. And eventually they'll break down, but typically it's the new stems that you've just opened up that bees will nest in that year. One thing we advocate across the board is leaving leaves where you can. So instead of chopping up your leaf material at the end of the fall, leave that thin layer. Or if you can't stand having them on the grass, break them up and spread them around your flower beds, which just allows the beneficial insects that nest in those leaves or overwinter in those leaves to make it through the year. So if you flail up all of your leaves or bag them up, then all those insects get taken out as well. So to avoid shredding them is a good strategy. They also can help build soil and provide that habitat. So just to zoom out a little bit, there are lots of ripple effects of taking these steps to protect pollinators in your yard. Providing them with native plants as habitat, it's an umbrella action that supports lots of other kinds of wildlife and creates these resilient plant and animal communities. So having plants like your redbud, your serviceberry, viburnums, winterberry holly, and others provide flowers that support bees, and then seeds and fruits that support birds and other wildlife. And then the invertebrates themselves, as I said at the beginning of the presentation, play key roles and are often the base of food chains. So Doug Tallamy has estimated that Carolina chickadees, that's pictured here, they have to gather about 10,000 caterpillars to successfully raise a brood of chicks in about a period of about 3 weeks. And it really helps to have some native trees around. Native trees support many more times the diversity and abundance of caterpillars than non-native trees. and help provide that important protein source. So oaks and willows, birches and maples are groups of trees that each support more than 300 species of moths and butterflies. So really an incredible amount of diversity supported by native trees. By taking these steps to support pollinators, the base of the food chain, the base of our ecosystem, we're supporting all the levels of the plant community and the wildlife that depends on it. So it has ripple effects that improve the functioning of our landscapes for birds, beneficial insects, and us. So if you need more ideas, I'd recommend, a great step is just observing the plants in your yard and your community. When I walk the dog, a lot of times what I'm doing is just checking out what everybody else has in their yards and figuring out what I need to put in mine next year. You can check out our resource library at xerces.org for all the reading material you could possibly want about pollinators and beneficial insects and milkweeds. You can also check out community science project opportunities you could get involved with, like Bumblebee Watch if you like going out with your smartphone and taking pictures of bumblebees. That can help contribute to research on abundance of especially rare and declining species. And consider supporting our work. We're a member-supported organization, which is what allows me to go out and do these kinds of presentations, and many of my colleagues to do the similar kind of outreach and education work. And then finally, 2 more slides. One is just, again, to mention the Bee City and Bee Campus USA programs. So Bee City affiliates essentially commit to establishing a committee that advocates for pollinators. They commit to creating and enhancing pollinator habitat on public and private land, and to incorporate pollinator-friendly practices into city policies and plans. So we have a Bee Campus USA program with similar goals, and University of Connecticut was the first Bee Campus USA affiliate in Connecticut. So if you're interested in learning more about Bee City and Bee Campus, you can visit beecityusa.org. And here's again, the resource library that we have available on our website. So with that, I'll open it up for questions. Thanks for listening.
And feel free to unmute yourself now if you would like to ask a question. Go ahead.
I think that's available now.
It should be.
Okay.
Hello, I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
So I have an old hayfield that I have now not mowed for the 3rd summer. It's turning into a really beautiful meadow full of wildflowers, goldenrod. I haven't really done anything specifically to help it. It's doing it by itself. I did have someone go in and cut down some autumn olives and some baby oaks, but there aren't a whole lot of woody plants growing up. But how often do I need to mow that? I mean, I'm afraid to mow it.
Yeah, that's a great question. So for those kinds of meadows, what we typically recommend is starting a rotational mowing program. So you would do about a third of the area in any given year. So you'd get into like a 3-year cycle where you're doing a third of the area in 1 year at a delayed fall mowing. So that would be around now, basically after bird breeding season and after monarchs have left. So just pick sort of your rotation. We also, you can do it in sort of a haphazard way if you don't want to designate, okay, this is the third I want to do this year and this is the third I want to do next year. You can do it haphazardly and try and kind of target the areas where you have woody plants coming in. So keeping your sort of your cottonwoods and oaks and whatever else you have coming in. But it sounds like you're on top of managing the invasives that are coming in. So that's great. But that's what I would recommend. That reserves, if you use the rotational mowing schedule, that reserves most of the area for nesting by bees and nesting by birds, so that you're not cutting down the whole meadow in every single year.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah,
Uh,
hi.
Hi. I have read a couple of books on backyard beekeeping. I'm intrigued by it, but I've also read a lot about how difficult it is and the die out and the various problems with that. Can you recommend can you give us an update? And can you recommend a website? I thought that maybe since you have Bee City and Bee Campus, that you might have resources for those who want to have backyard hives.
Yeah, so that's a good question. Backyard beekeeping is more challenging than it's cracked up to be, just in part because of the challenges of getting your hives to survive both summer and winter. Um, so the the big headline hitting colony collapse disorder um, was really kind of a specific phenomenon that we don't see as much of now, which is the disappearing bees, where all of the workers disappeared and left a brood behind in the hive. But the sort of overall colony loss numbers are still really high from year to year. So, on average, I think we're seeing 30 to 40% losses in commercial hives and even higher in backyard hives, which is largely sort of a combination of varroa mites and different diseases. So we're really not, our organization is focused on biodiversity conservation. So we are primarily focused on native bee conservation. So we don't talk a lot about hives and how to manage them. We don't really have the expertise on that on the staff because that's more of like a domesticated bee. And we're trying to conserve most of the other species. So mostly what we talk about is how you can support both local hives in your communities and wild bees around you by planting flowers. But if you are interested in backyard beekeeping, I think I don't necessarily have the best place to send you. I know University of Minnesota Bee Lab has lots of resources on bees, honeybees as well. Um, but yeah, I'm sorry I don't have like the one thing to send you to.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I have another question. You've talked about pesticides. Talk about Roundup.
Talk about it in terms of bees.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a complicated one. So we don't know in a lot in general about herbicide impacts to pollinators. We know a little bit more about glyphosate because it's been so widely used and so widely studied. Um, so there have been a couple of studies in the last few years looking at how exposure to glyphosate can actually disturb the microbiome of bees. So you spray glyphosate on a crop or an area with flowering plants and it doesn't act immediately. So bees do have time to sort of get into an area and pick up glyphosate in the nectar of those plants that have been treated. At that point, researchers were looking at sort of shifts in the microbial communities of their guts and how it might make them more susceptible to different gut pathogens. So it's not like an immediate, there's, herbicides are tested for their direct toxicity. So glyphosate can be applied at high rates and not outright kill a bee. But it might have these other sort of longer term impacts on bee health. And that's true, I think, for other herbicides. What we usually think about with herbicides is the more indirect impacts of using them widely for weed control in ag systems, and that removes a lot of the flowering plants from those systems, which would provide pollen and nectar for bees. So herbicide-based weed management, that was one of the reasons that milkweeds declined so strongly in the Midwest was after glyphosate was introduced as a major weed tool in the Midwest. So a lot of times we're really thinking about more the indirect impacts of food source removal than we are the direct toxicity, because most of them have yet to be shown to have, real direct toxicity to pollinators, if that makes sense. Feel free to ask for clarity. Sometimes I ramble.
No, thanks. No, I was just concerned because there's sort of local use by in a kind of pollinator preserve to paint the stumps of things like autumn olive with Roundup. Which
Yeah. So that actually, of all of the herbicide uses, sort of the basal bark treatment or stump treatment is probably the least likely to end up exposing pollinators. So that's one of the lowest risk uses that I can think of for herbicides. And in cases where it's being used for invasive removal with a basal bark or a stump treatment, and that's being replaced with native vegetation, I definitely see that as a long-term win. Short-term loss, but low risk of exposure, and a long-term gain for native plants.
okay, thank you.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
We had a question. We always used to allow milkweed to grow around on our property, and we love the monarchs. But a couple of years ago, we started getting these black and white caterpillars that actually had toxic spines. And so we've been taking the milkweed out because it's a problem when you get stung by one of those caterpillars. It's not pleasant. And I was wondering if you can tell us anything about this, or would the monarchs outcompete those if we let it go but further from the house?
That's more likely to be like a local population. So if you didn't have milkweed there a few years, you might not see those as frequently if you let the milkweed then come back. But that's hard for me to say.
Okay. We've
Yeah.
never seen these before, and it was a little scary because one patch of milkweed was right close to the house. And once the caterpillars ate all the milkweed, they started climbing up the siding of the house towards the door.
Uh-huh.
And they were definitely not a friendly caterpillar.
Yeah, I could understand that. I mean, if you have space to add some milkweed farther away from for your house where those caterpillars might not be able to crawl so far, that might be a better option.
Okay, but you don't know whether they compete with like if they compete with the monarch caterpillar, or if we did that, if the monarchs would even have a chance.
Yeah, I think populations of those different insects can fluctuate really widely from year to year. So there might be years where you have a huge number of, I'm not sure exactly what species that would be, but if they're basically eating down the milkweed, and you've had monarchs laid on that same milkweed, they might be competitive. But other years you might not have the same population numbers, and milkweeds and monarchs might do just fine. That'd be my guess.
Can I ask one more question?
Sure.
We noticed this year, we originally planted Joe Pye because we knew it was a late bloomer. At this year, is it because it's dry? It bloomed awfully early. Like we have Agastache and Joe Pye, and the Joe Pye completed blooming before the Agastache did.
Yeah, I think it was. I had the same thing happen in my yard. My Joe Pye bloomed early and then bloomed kind of rapidly relative to other years. And I think it must have had to do with sort of hot and dry weather.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. It does. Joe Pye likes to have a little bit of moisture. So you can throw in a little bit of extra water if you have it right around the house.
Any other questions? Going once, going twice. All right, well, I want to be respectful of everyone's time. And Emily, thank you so much for doing this for us. Is there a way, like if anyone wanted to get in contact with you, is that possible? Or is there a way to contact the Xerces Society?
Yeah, I should have had my email on this last slide, but my email is just my name, emily.may@xerces.org. So feel free to get in touch with me that way. You can also look me up on the Xerces website, along with all the other info that we have on there.
Awesome, thank you. And the last thing I want to say is for those of you, I mean, this applies to everyone, but for those of you who are members of Joshua's Trust, we actually just got these pollinator pathway signs. So if you have a pollinator patch in your yard and you want to register for the pollinator pathway, you can get one of these signs from us. You don't have to order it through the website. You just have to let us know that that's what you're doing. And if you're not a member of Joshua's Trust and you're living in the area, of course, we'd love to have you on board as part of our community. So you can contact Joshua's Trust at administration@joshuastrust.org for more information about the signs, membership, or just what we do. But we really appreciate you all being here tonight. I hope that this was helpful for you and inspires you as you plan your gardens for next year, or even how you take care of them going into the winter. So thank you, everybody, and I hope you have a great night.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.